When winter settles on a small Pennsylvania town, the world outside my window slows to a hush. The porch lights of my neighbors flicker on one by one, little beacons against the cold. In this house, my house, the lamps glow a soft amber, the same lamps I once polished when my husband came home from work, and my boy was small enough to fall asleep in my arms. Tonight, those lamps burn for no one in particular. They burn because I cannot bring myself to turn them off. They burn because somewhere out there, my only son might be driving past, might glance toward this old porch, might see the light and know that his mother's door is still open. I have kept that lamp burning for years. I never imagined I'd be telling this story out loud. But my granddaughter asked me tonight to share the truth. She is here beside me now, legs folded on the sofa, her wide eyes reflecting the glow from the fire. I can hear the tiny scrape of her pencil as she draws on a notepad, but mostly she just listens. Children have a way of listening that grown-ups forget. So I begin where it all started, long before the silence, before the slammed door and the unanswered calls. I begin with the days when my heart was still whole, when love filled these rooms like the smell of fresh bread on a winter morning. I grew up in a time when neighbors knew each other's birthdays, and every back door was unlocked. My childhood was not rich in money, but it was overflowing in noise and togetherness. We ate beans and cornbread, sang hymns on Sundays, and believed that family was a promise stronger than any law. When I married your grandfather, I carried that belief like a lantern. We were young, too young by today's standards, but we had hope. We worked side by side in a little hardware store on Main Street, counting every penny, laughing at our own mistakes. The winters were long, the summers sticky, but we were never lonely. Then, after years of trying and praying, I gave birth to a son. My only child. From the moment I held him, I felt the weight of every promise I'd ever made to God or to myself. I whispered into his tiny ear, "You will never feel unloved. You will never wonder if I am here for you." For a long time I kept that promise. I sang him to sleep while snow tapped at the window panes. I stayed up through fevers and nightmares. I worked extra shifts when his father's back gave out so that we could afford new shoes each September. Each sacrifice felt small compared to the love I carried. But life has a way of testing even the strongest vows. When my husband passed suddenly, your grandfather, my first love, I thought grief would be the hardest mountain I'd ever climb. I was wrong. Losing a spouse is like losing a part of yourself, but losing a living child to distance and silence, that is a wound that never scabs over. After the funeral, my son changed. At first it was subtle, a shorter phone call, a visit postponed. He was building a life of his own in another city, and I told myself that was natural. Young men must stretch their wings. I smiled when he brought home his new girlfriend, though something in her eyes told me she didn't want the messy warmth of family. Still, I believed love would outlast inconvenience. I believed if I kept the house tidy and the welcome warm, he would keep coming back. I baked pies. I mailed cards. I called every Sunday. Sometimes he answered. Sometimes he let the machine pick up. I told myself he was busy, that work was demanding, that this was just a season. Seasons change, but some winters do not end. My granddaughter shifts closer, her small hand finding mine. Her fingers are soft, unscarred by years of dishwater and cold. She asks, barely above a whisper, "Grandma, did he ever say why?" I pause. The truth is complicated, layered with choices and pride and the quiet cruelties people inflict without meaning to. But a child deserves honesty even if it trembles. "No, sweetheart," I say. Not in words that made sense. Sometimes love disappears not with a shout, but with a series of small silences. You hardly notice the first one. Then one day you wake up and the house is quiet enough to hear your own heart breaking. The wind rattles the window pane. Outside, the porch light burns steadily, a solitary star in the frozen dusk. I squeeze her hand and continue. The last time my son visited, the air smelled of pine and cold rain. It was late November, the kind of gray afternoon when daylight fades before supper. I remember watching his car pull into the driveway, my heart leaping like it always did. I had baked his favorite apple pie, set the table with the good china, and turned on every lamp so the house glowed like it used to when his father came home from work. He stepped inside, tall and handsome in his city coat, but there was a distance in his eyes that chilled me more than the weather. Behind him stood the woman he'd chosen to marry. She smiled politely, but her glance skimmed the room like someone checking for exits. We sat down to eat. I tried to fill the silence with small talk. Weather, recipes, a funny story from church. He nodded but barely looked up from his plate. She checked her phone again and again. My chest tightened, but I told myself to be patient. Love needs room to breathe. After dessert, he cleared his throat and said words that felt rehearsed. "Mom, we're heading back early. There's a lot to do before Monday." No apology, no plan for the next visit. Just a quiet announcement that the evening, and something deeper, was ending. I walked them to the door. The porch light flickered in the drizzle. He hugged me quickly, one arm, emotion more habit than affection. Then he stepped into the dark, and the door closed with a sound that echoed far beyond the hallway. Days later, a message arrived. Not a phone call, just a text. It said, "You won't be joining us for the holidays this year. We need space as a couple. Please understand. Please understand." 2 words that can slice a heart wide open. I read the text over and over, searching for hidden meaning, for some clue that love still lived beneath the politeness. But all I found was finality. A door had closed. My only child was asking, no, telling me to stay away. I sat in this very chair, the same one I'm sitting in now, staring at the soft glow of the lamp. Outside, snow began to fall, slow and silent. I wanted to scream, to call, to drive to his home and demand an explanation. Instead, I folded my phone shut and whispered a prayer that he might feel even a fraction of the ache that was devouring me. Winter stretched on like an endless hallway. Friends invited me to their celebrations, but I declined with polite excuses. I decorated a small tree alone, humming carols under my breath so the house wouldn't feel so empty. At night, I left the porch light burning, as if its gentle glow could guide my son back the way a lighthouse calls ships home. People sometimes ask if I was angry. Perhaps for a moment, but mostly I felt a sorrow so deep it had no name. Anger is hot and sharp. Sorrow is a cold river that seeps into every crack of your soul. One evening, weeks after that text, I stood at the window and watched the neighborhood children sledding down the hill. Their laughter floated across the snow, pure and unguarded. I thought of my son at that age, his cheeks red from cold, his eyes bright with trust, and I whispered into the glass, "Where did we lose each other?" No answer came, only the steady fall of snow and the hum of the old heater working to keep the house warm. Silence, I have learned, is a patient teacher. It forces you to listen not to words, but to the steady rhythm of your own heart. In those long months, I discovered truths I had avoided for years. First, love is not a leash. You can raise a child with every ounce of devotion and still watch him walk a path that excludes you. Love gives freedom, and freedom sometimes means goodbye. Second, forgiveness is not a gift you give to the other person. It is the key you use to unlock your own chains. If I waited for an apology that might never come, I would stay frozen in that winter forever. Forgiveness, I realized, was my only way back to life. So I forgave my son in the quiet of this living room. Not because he asked, not because he deserved it, but because I could not bear the weight of bitterness. I whispered his name, imagined his face as a little boy, and let the tears fall until they tasted of salt and release. My granddaughter squeezes my hand again, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "Grandma," she asks softly, "do you still love him?" The answer comes without hesitation, more than he will ever know. Love does not vanish because a door closes. It waits like this lamp, steady and unwavering. It waits in the hope that one day a heart will soften, a phone will ring, and the space between us will narrow to a single step. Until then, I keep the lamp burning. The winter that followed was the coldest I can remember, though the thermometer never dropped lower than years before. It wasn't the weather. It was the quiet. Morning light would creep across the floorboards like a shy visitor. I would sit with a cup of tea and listen to the groan of the old radiator. Every sound in this house seemed louder because there were so few of them. The tick of the clock, the sigh of the wood beams, even the whisper of my own breathing, they all reminded me of what was missing. I kept busy with small tasks. I mended the quilt my mother had sewn when I was a girl. I polished the brass lamp that had belonged to my grandmother. Cooked meals that filled the house with warm scents no one else would taste. Each act felt like a thread connecting me to the generations of women before me, women who endured loss and kept their homes alive anyway. At night, before I went to bed, I made sure the lamp in the front window was lit, a simple ritual, a signal to no one in particular, and yet to everyone. The soft amber glow spilled onto the porch and into the street, a silent message. Someone still waits. Someone still loves. Neighbors would sometimes comment, "Your lamp is always on, even late. Are you expecting someone?" I'd smile and say, "I'm just making sure the night isn't too dark." But in my heart, I whispered the truth. If my son drives by, even by accident, I want him to know he can come home. One evening, after another day of unanswered texts and empty hours, I sat down at the kitchen table with a sheet of stationery. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, a scent I've loved since I was a young bride. I began to write a letter, not to send, but to speak the words my heart carried. I told him about the pie cooling on the windowsill, the way the sparrows gathered at the feeder, the joke the postman shared that morning. I told him how proud I still was of the boy who once built castles from couch cushions and believed his mother could fix anything. And at the bottom, after 3 pages of careful handwriting, I wrote the sentence that mattered most. My door is open. My lamp is lit. I love you always. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. There are many now, stacked like quiet prayers. Perhaps he will read them one day. Perhaps not. But writing them keeps my love alive and my hope from freezing. In silence, truths arrive like soft-footed guests. I learned that pain does not cancel love. It refines it. I learned that waiting is not weakness. It is the discipline of faith. And I learned that a heart can break and still beat with gratitude. On the coldest nights, when loneliness pressed hardest, I would wrap myself in the old quilt and remember my own mother's advice. When you cannot change the storm, tend the fire. So I tended the fire, inside the stove, inside my soul. I read the Psalms, aloud. I practiced the piano though my fingers ached. I baked bread and shared loaves with neighbors who didn't know they were rescuing me as much. As I was feeding them, the lamp burned on. One icy morning, a knock startled me awake. It was little Grace from next door, clutching a plate of cookies. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her eyes wide with the unfiltered kindness only children possess. "Mom says you shouldn't be alone so much," she said. "Can I sit with you?" We shared cookies at the kitchen table. Grace chattered about school projects and sledding adventures. I listened, laughed, and felt the brittle edges of loneliness soften. Before leaving, she looked at the glowing lamp and asked, "Who is that for?" I hesitated, then answered, "For someone I love very much. The light tells him he can always come back." Grace nodded with a wisdom far beyond her years. "Then he will," she said. Simply, children have a way of planting hope like seeds in winter soil. That evening, as snowflakes whirled like tiny dancers outside the window, I opened an old photo album. There was my son at 5, face smeared with birthday cake. There he was at 12, holding a fishing rod twice his height. Each picture a frozen moment of joy, proof that love had once been simple and certain. Tears blurred the images, but I smiled through them. No one can steal those memories. No door can lock them away. My granddaughter, my listener tonight, leans her head against my shoulder. "Grandma," she whispers, "if Daddy never comes back, will you be okay?" I kiss the crown of her hair and answer the truth. Yes, my sweet one. Because love is bigger than visits and phone calls. Love is what makes us brave enough to wait, and strong enough to keep living even when the waiting hurts. She squeezes my hand, and together we watch the lamp's soft glow ripple across the snow. Spring came late that year, as if winter didn't want to loosen its grip. But one April morning, I opened the door and felt it. The faint softness of new air. The snow had melted, revealing patches of earth that smelled of possibility. The lamp still burned in the window, but now it shone beside a pot of daffodils pushing up through the soil. That same morning, a letter arrived, not from my son, from a neighbor down the street. Mrs. Alvarez inside was a short note in careful handwriting. "I see your light every evening. It gives me courage when my own house feels lonely. Thank you for keeping it on." I pressed the paper to my chest. I had thought the lamp was a private signal to one person, but here was proof. Its glow reached others, quiet souls walking their own roads of waiting. Sometimes the love we send to one heart spills outward and warms many. The weeks unfolded like shy blossoms. Neighbors began stopping by, first with a wave, then with small gifts. Mr. Patel brought fresh bread. A young couple brought leftover soup. Even the mailman lingered a little longer, sharing small stories from his route. I never announced my pain. I never told them about the unanswered calls. But kindness has a way of sensing where to land. One evening, Mrs. Alvarez invited me to join a neighborhood book circle. I almost said no. Grief had made me hesitant, like a bird unsure of flight. But I remembered my mother's words, "Tend the fire," so I said yes. In that living room, surrounded by books and strangers, I felt something shift. Laughter returned in small doses, like cautious sunlight. I listened to stories that weren't mine, and for the first time in months, my world grew larger than my sorrow. My granddaughter, my little evening companion, noticed the change. One night she asked, "Grandma, does it help to talk to other people?" I smiled. "Oh yes, sweetheart. Pain grows when we hide it, but it softens when we share life, even simple moments." She nodded, thoughtful. Maybe Daddy just doesn't know how to share yet. Children often speak the truths adults fear to name. As the night deepened, I found myself sharing a memory with my granddaughter, one I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. "When your father was born," I began, "we lived in a tiny apartment above a grocery store. Money was tight, but I painted stars on the nursery ceiling with glow paint, so when the lights went out, he'd see the sky and know dreams were bigger than our worries." I paused, picturing the soft blue walls, the crib my husband and I assembled at midnight. There were nights when I thought exhaustion would swallow me whole. But then he'd reach out his tiny hand, and I'd remember that love can feed a soul more than any meal. The memory wrapped the room in quiet wonder. My granddaughter squeezed my hand. That's why you always keep the lamp on, isn't it? Because you still see the stars you painted for him. Tears welled in my eyes. Yes, my love. The lamp is just another star. A reminder that light waits for anyone ready to look up. By summer, the garden bloomed with wild color. Neighbors stopped to admire the marigolds, and I caught myself laughing and unguarded. Easy sound. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching children to sew and mend. Each stitch felt like a tiny act of restoration, mending fabric while life quietly mended me. I still wrote letters to my son, still lit the lamp each evening, but my heart no longer lived only in the ache of waiting. It began to live in the rhythm of giving. One late August evening, just as the sun bled gold across the horizon, I heard footsteps on the porch. The doorbell chimed, a sound that felt both foreign and familiar. My heart leapt, then steadied. I opened the door. It was not my son. It was Grace, the little neighbor girl, now taller, holding a bouquet of daisies. "Mom said these are for you," she said. "And I wanted to tell you, I like your lamp. It makes me feel safe when I walk home from school." I knelt to her level, the scent of daisies mixing with the warm air of late summer. "Thank you, Grace. Do you know why I keep it on?" She nodded. "Because love never gives up. Sometimes wisdom arrives wearing sneakers and carrying flowers." That night, after Grace left, I sat by the glowing lamp and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for my son, wherever he was, but for every soul the light had touched, for neighbors, for children, for strangers passing on dark nights. I realized something profound. I had started this ritual to reach one heart, but it had reached many, including my own. The lamp was no longer a plea. It was a declaration. I am here. I love. And I will keep loving, whether or not the door ever opens. My granddaughter leaned against me, her small hand resting on mine. "Grandma," she said softly, "even if Daddy never comes back, your light will always find someone." I kissed her forehead. "Yes, darling, that's the miracle of love. It never stops at the door where it was first sent. It travels, it multiplies, and it lights paths we cannot see."